Hello, my name is James Cook. I'm with the University of Maine at Augusta, and this video is being recorded to talk about what is perhaps the most central element in the constructionist view of social problems, namely the claim. Because the whole idea of a constructionist view of social problems, which asserts that social problems are socially constructed, is that they are based on the claim that social problems exist and are worth doing something about. So this is in opposition to an objectivist point of view in which some external standard can be met that everyone who is reasonable would agree upon about extent of social harm. If it surpasses that level, it becomes a problem, which then is paid attention to in an uncomplicated, undramatic, uncontested way. For constructionists, however, the whole point is that social problems are contested, and they're contested in ways that are not purely scientific. They're contested in ways that are not purely rational. What's really neat about the constructionist point of view, I think, though, is that it says we can begin to study this irrational process, this unscientific process, through some ways that are systematic, that are rational. We can begin to understand how this system works, even if the rules by which it works don't follow necessarily some kind of rules of logic. It can be logically understood. So the first thing Joel Best does in his constructionist approach to social problems, when he wants to think about the claim about a social problem, is to divide it into three elements. The first element of a claim is its grounding, the grounds. The grounds of a social claim are some kind of argument or story or demonstration, some edifice upon which people feel able to conclude that a social problem exists in a significant way. Second come the warrants, which are these arguments, these assertions that lead, hopefully, according to the social problems proponents, hopefully to the point where people agree that something needs to be done about it. And conclusions are simply what it is that is to be done. Because two people might agree that a social problem exists, they might say there's something that needs to be done about it, but they might disagree about the conclusion. So the combination of a certain set of grounds, a certain set of warrants, and a certain set of conclusions together makes a claim that is successful or unsuccessful, coherent or incoherent, meaning that it all hangs together or it kind of falls apart. There can be poor claims that don't have all three elements put together successfully. There can be successful claims that do put all of those claims together successfully. And as we'll see later in our coursework, it's even possible for a well-crafted claim to be unsuccessful in its trajectory through society. So let's talk about these three elements of a claim a little bit more, though. So when we think about the first, grounds, it best describes a few elements that you can look for in grounds. The claim that there are elements in society, that there's some phenomenon going on that constitutes a problem that is social and that is worth paying attention to. The first thing he says to look out for is something called a typifying example. It's usually a story. It is one case or a handful of cases, right? Usually just one. A story about one person or a small set of people who experience this problem. Best says, you know, this often is not an actual typical person. If we were to do a statistical analysis of who it is that experiences such a problem, but it is nevertheless typifying, meaning that the reader or the viewer or the listener, depending on how this is delivered as grounds, is meant to see this as a typical person. So notice the first thing that comes in is the possibility of deception. It is possible to make a claim with grounds that aren't actually typical. So the first thing that you can do if you are starting to look at a claim is to ask yourself when evaluating it, is this story that's being told actually a typical case, or is it an extreme case? The value rhetorically in an extreme case is that it makes us feel most strongly, makes us react most strongly. A mild or moderate case may not do the job, even though it may be representing what is often the most typical situation faced by someone who's having such a social problem. The second thing that grounds need is a name. If you're going to say this problem matters, you have to give it a name. And the name you give it can make or break it. So being bothered, pardon me, being bothered is not so much a strong social problem by the sound of it, is it? Being harassed, on the other hand, does sound like a more significant problem. Words matter. Being hit sounds like a reasonably significant problem. Being assaulted sounds like a really big problem. So the name has to be chosen wisely. It's rhetorical. It's not necessarily based on the most accurate description again, but it's based on the kind of reaction that it will get from a human being. Finally, a statistic will often be used. Now, these statistics don't have to be true. They can be made up. For instance, there is a statistic going around that says that 10,000 women a year died from abortions before Roe v. Wade. And the Washington Post, in a recent analysis, found that this was actually based on an estimate. It was the highest possible estimate, and it was not in the decades directly before Roe versus Wade, but it was in many years earlier in the 1930s and 1940s, before the advent of more modern medicine. And yet it is still being used, and it is still being bandied about. Why? Because it is most effective. So in a typifying example that is presented, in the name that is given, and in a statistic that is offered, you can think about what is the reaction that the people who are putting forward these grounds might be working for. Well, first of all, they want to show that this social problem exists. It is worth paying attention to. Why might it be worth paying attention to? Because it is big, and because it is impactful. Those are two different elements, right? First, it has to actually exist. If it doesn't exist, then it's difficult but not impossible to make it a social claim. And we'll talk about that later when we examine moral panics. To say it's big, to say it's common, is usually helpful, but that might not itself be enough. Consider the common cold. We often get the sniffles. Some people never do, and they're very lucky, but most people do, once or more a year. It's a very common thing to experience. That's why we call it the common cold. And yet we don't really tend to worry about it as a social problem very much. Why? Because for most people, a common cold is not going to kill or significantly, permanently impair someone. And so we have to think about it being harmful. a social problem being harmful in order to grab people's attention. And so much worse than the common cold might be something called RSV, which is an upper respiratory virus, but is one that for babies is possibly fatal. And so that is something that can really grab our attention. It can be quite alarming. Another element of the problem that helps us to establish that this is something worth paying attention to is the idea that it has been hitherto neglected, that nobody is looking at it, that nobody has been taking care of it, and yet silently, stealthily, it has been creeping forward and causing a great deal of harm in a way that is much more common than thought before. So think about, with these typifying examples, what is offered, and then think about with statistics, what is offered. And note that both are often used, and they offer different things. The first is that the typifying example is typically intimate, in the sense that it brings us close into someone else's life, and we can see it as if we were there, as if we were in the room. The second thing that a typifying example can be is therefore disturbing, because we can place ourselves in that situation, and either ourselves as the victim of such a problem, or ourselves as someone who witnesses this happening to someone we love, someone we care about. That you will hear phrases like, it could be your son, it could be your daughter, it could be the one you love. When you hear that, think, oh, this typifying example is meant to make me remember in a really disturbing way that my loved ones or I might be vulnerable. It's alarming in that sense. It should be memorable. So you're going to look for a vivid story, one that paints tiny details that make you feel more embedded in the situation. So it wouldn't simply say, in 1975, a young man died of AIDS. No, instead, it would paint the picture of what the hospital ward looked like where this young man died. It would give the young man a name. It would give him an age. It would describe his occupation, or if he's too young to have an occupation, the occupation of his parents. It would indicate some things he liked to do, some hobbies, some things that would make him seem like you or me, right? And then we would talk in detail about what it is like to die of infection with HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, and to have the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, that results from it. And this is often really hard to listen to, hard to see, and yet we're brought in through the storytelling device of introducing ourselves to someone that seems like someone that's kind of sympathetic, someone we might care about. We want to hear how it ends. Contrast that with the statistic. Statistic presents a patina of expertise, the impression that this has been a carefully studied problem, that there is authority standing behind it, and that authority has brought many resources to bear to bring this truth to you, this number, this level of occurrence, or the rate of infection if this is a disease, or the likelihood that someone will incur a negative consequence, or if we're talking about how common this already understood to be bad thing is, to indicate one in how many people will experience this. Those kind of statistics are the sort of things that if we present them in a very alarming fashion, it can be memorable, just as memorable as a story. But a story and a statistic put together can often be the most memorable of all. And the idea is that it has to stick in the mind. It has to be what is called salient. Salience is the, if you're looking in a field of vision, something that pops out. Salience means this is a claim. This is a part of a claim called a grounds that pops out. It makes you remember it and think, boy, this is a problem. Boy, this is worth me paying attention to. So some substantive problems with grounds are that they can be made up. They can be false. They don't have to be true in order for us to share them, as we have all learned if we've been on Facebook or Twitter. Often there are absolute falsehoods that have been shared. These used to be called urban legends, and now we think of them as memes that seem to have the aura of truth. And they certainly are arresting, but they could be false. They could be true, but the tint that is lent to this truth could be an exaggeration. That is, perhaps if we're talking about a disease, an illness, we're talking about the person's worst day in this disease, and not about what happened the next Tuesday when they actually got about with their lives all right. Or the fact that most of the time the sufferers of this disease don't feel this bad. If we are talking about perhaps a class of people, such as an immigrant, and we're thinking about immigration as a social problem, there could be an exaggeration of the level, perhaps, of criminality of illegal immigrants. And to do that, we would use atypical examples. And yet, implicitly, we would be thinking, this is what you get when you get an illegal immigrant. You get a rapist, a murderer, a child beater, someone who doesn't know how to drive a truck and is barreling down the highway, what have you. If we hear these stories again and again, we may come to think that's typical. We may be led by these grounds stories to think of that kind of hazard as typical, even when it may not be the case. Finally, what's really interesting about these grounds is that they offer the appearance of pattern through storytelling and statistic dropping in place of actually carefully documented patterns. Usually the statistics offered in grounds in social problems, unless they're very clearly cited, are not from careful research, which is the sort that the objectivists would favor. Instead, they are either invented or exaggerated. They're stories that are not typical, and they lead us to rely on this very human need that we have for understanding the world through story. So, it is possible for an audience to be manipulated by grounds. Indeed, those who are using claims in social problems work to move a social problem forward will attempt to manipulate their audience. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to sway us. And so we need to be very careful and check through those grounds. The next aspect, once we come to say, yes, I understand this is a social problem, is to say, well, it's worth doing something about this. And this is where we move from a claim about the way things are to the idea, as Best describes it in his constructionist argument, of a mismatch between the way the world is, as described in those grounds, and the way that the reader or viewer or listener, the way they believe the world should be. And whenever you hear the word should or ought or some similar judgment, you know that you're in the presence of cultural values. Now, in Sociology 101, we defined culture as a set of beliefs, practices, and values that are embedded either within a large society or, within the case of a subculture, a smaller community or group. So, the values, the moral sense of what is good and right and proper, is in some ways an ideal against which the typifying example and the statistic are compared. And to the extent that there is a small gap, well, you don't need to do much, perhaps. But to the extent that there is a large gap, that there is a huge mismatch between the way the world ought to be in terms of some set of values and the way that the world is, then you can move people to action. The other thing that it's possible to do is to sidestep cultural values and play directly to emotions, although values and emotions are tied to one another. So we can try to provoke, in terms of emotions, protectiveness. And affection. How can you do that? Well, we can take advantage of this desire that human beings have to take care of small ones of their species or of other species. So, insert a puppy, insert a kitten, insert something small and cute and furry. A teddy bear even will do. Better yet, a child. If there's a child in there, protectiveness and affection get triggered as emotions. On the other hand, if there's an element in this story that you want individuals to feel distanced from, that you don't want them to feel something in common with, you need to provoke a different set of emotions. Disgust is a good one. And so there are certain elements that most people have disgust towards, such as excrement, bodily fluids, the idea of monstrousness, monstrosity, some aberration, some stigma, something about someone that, if you have an image in which there is some form of deformity, for better or for worse, rightly or wrongly, these tend to provoke disgust in many people. And therefore, using those in describing a set of people who are problems or a set of circumstances or happenings that are problems is a good way to provoke disgust. Discoloration. So you'll often notice that advertisements, political advertisements that are attempting to distance the viewer from the target will put a shade on, perhaps green or red, that make the person somehow not seem natural to us. We can also talk about emotions of guilt and responsibility. So we can talk about ideas of punishment, of incarceration, of judgment. We can talk about emotions of anger and of vengeance. If these are triggered, the idea of righteous anger and outrage, that something has happened and a feeling that it must be righted, can stimulate our bodies. It can stimulate our minds and make us feel like we ought to do something about this. And also sympathetic pain. So if you can, in a warrant, provide a positive emotion, establish protectiveness and affection, and then you can, in the story, have that object, whether that is an object of a person or a puppy or a teddy bear, go through some form of pain or some form of suffering. In our mirror neurons, which are elements inside our brains that take what we see and process it as though we ourselves were experiencing it, if you can trigger those mirror neurons, then we can, in sympathy, feel a little bit of that pain ourselves, especially if we have grown attached emotionally somehow. So these warrants are like, in some ways, setting up a screenplay, setting up a stage play. They also, to return to values, can be helped by involving values that trigger these emotions. So think of responsibility and duty. If you are someone who believes in personal responsibility and personal duty, and you tell a story about someone who could have helped someone who was, a small kid, or, there's a cute little animal involved, and didn't do it. Someone who could have helped but didn't. The emotion that you feel is a sympathetic guilt. Oh, that's awful. I would hate to be in that situation and not do anything. Clearly, we must do something. If you think about rights and freedoms, and you tie them in, and there's an American flag in the background, and then you talk about some people out there, your opponents, or something happening that threatens our rights and our freedoms, in this country. What does that provoke? Outrage, moral outrage. You can refer to, similarly, for individuals who believe that equality is an important aspect of this country, or perhaps they are in a subculture that values especially diversity, and the idea that some people are being censored and excluded. You can also provoke that outrage by simply pointing out, assuming that your audience has these values of equality or diversity, pointing out that there's a place where it is not being met in reality, this ideal. Safety, security, risk, on the other hand, right? Danger versus safety and security are values that are really important to some people. A sense of threat, and therefore a need to establish safety and security, can be very important. Another set of values that people can hold dear are economy, thrift, versus cost and waste, right? These are words that are imbued with judgment, and we can be anxious about them. That's another emotion. Or we can even fear economic downturn. What would that do to our family? Cue the children. Piety can be brought in. So religiosity, the use of iconic symbols to represent a religion that is threatened, a faith that is threatened, a spiritual path or way of life that is threatened, whether that is made specific to a particular religion or to religiosity overall. We can take our sense of loyalty, loyalty to family, loyalty to community. These are values that we might have, that we place a strong investment of ourselves in, that we believe family and community are important and we should not betray that. And yet we could be put in a position where that starts to happen. Or there could be this external force that could be betraying our families, our communities. And all of a sudden, that starts to feel like danger. We start to feel anxiety, fear, protectiveness, especially toward those elements that we feel we have affection toward. All of this together, emotions that are created, values that trigger these emotions, produce inside the subject, if the warrants work, negative emotions, stress, a strain, this gap between the way the world ought to be, between what is right and good and proper and what is. And it doesn't feel comfortable. And it needs to be resolved. It's a dissonance. It's a discomfort. And the way to resolve it is through some action. So that brings us to the third part of Joel Best's description of what claims are, which is conclusions. You can take someone to the point of saying, yes, we have to do something, but what is it that needs to be done? What action should be taken to resolve a problem? That is the conclusion that a successful claims maker will have in mind. These, as Best points out, can be of two sorts. There can be a short-term goal that is not the ultimate goal, but it helps you get there. It could be an awareness. So often awareness months are having this in mind. They want people to start thinking about this subject just a little bit more. They want to give voice to stories. And they want people to hear these stories, right? And to begin to embed those in their own cultural view of what threatens the world versus what doesn't. And then there are long-term solutions. And those long-term solutions are typically, as Best describes them, policies. Policies are rules, they are laws, they are codes, ways that organizations and institutions, all the way from the Cub Scouts to your local grocery store, if it comes to food safety policy, all the way up to the United States government or a federal government of another country that sets rules, the way things are going to be. And those rules are put in place in order to solve some kind of what? Some kind of social problem. So these conclusions can have a varying level of detail. The most vague could be this notion that something must be done. It may not be specified, but we have to do something. That often, if you're going to really have a successful long-term way of tackling a social problem, is going to generate a little bit more detail. Bullet-pointed lists of actual policies with all the operationalization of the actions included. Operationalization meaning how in practical, real life, boots on the ground courses of action do you go about doing something? What are the specific changes to be made? Sometimes it's vague, sometimes it's very clear. And what kind of action one might take is again based on a set of values, where values are what we cherish, what we believe to be important, what we believe to be legitimate, what we believe to be appropriate for a kind of action, what we believe the typical solution would be. So, I mean, if you're a mental health professional, you might see solutions in terms of therapy, some form of new therapy that we would come up with. If you were a liberal politician, liberal in the sense of American politics, not in the sense of economics, you would think about regulation. If you were a conservative politician, you might think about, or a libertarian politician, you might think about deregulation as a set of actions. So the kind of values that either you as the claims maker or the audience that you're trying to get in touch with holds to is going to lead to a different set of solutions, even when the nature of the problem and the extent of the problem and the need to do something is agreed upon by all parties. What the solution is to that problem may have something to do with the values people bring to the table, or the values that are activated, which means that after everybody agrees, yes, we're going to do something, there is still more claims-making work to be done to bring people to the finish line that you have in mind as a social problems advocate, someone who wants to solve a social problem. And in that sense, the strategic social problems worker, the social problems entrepreneur, you might say, a moral entrepreneur who is trying to get people to a point from the way the world is to the way they believe the world should be, is going to use culture, the set of values, the set of beliefs about what is going on, the set of values, the set of ideas about the way the world should be, and the set of practices that are typical for engaging in social problems. Practices, values, beliefs, that's all culture. And they can be used as tools. There is a piece by sociologist Ann Swidler, 1986, in the American Sociological Review. It's called Culture in Action, Symbols and Strategies. And in that article, Ann Swidler draws an image. She says culture is like a toolkit. You can just imagine it's in there. And in a toolkit, there are lots of different kinds of tools. And you can bring them out and you can see if they fit the problem you have, right? Is the problem that you have you need to put in a screw? Well, what kind of screw head do you have? Is it a Phillips or is this a straight head rule? A screw. Is it not a screw at all, but a nail? Then you don't want a screwdriver, you want a hammer. So you pull the hammer out and that will get that nail in the piece of wood. You have to carefully pick a cultural element, whether it is a value, a belief, or a typical practice that is going to be accepted by other people, the people in your audience, in order to successfully move those people. And the neat thing about societies is that we don't have a monolithic culture that everyone agrees to. So one of the recently observed truths about American politics is that when they're asked to describe the world and the way they feel about the world, conservatives are more likely than liberals to make descriptions of disgust and to express disgust. And this can be about non-political things. about elements of food, elements of clothing, things like that. And so using disgust at a situation is more likely to be effective if the audience you are making a claim toward is relatively conservative rather than liberal. Liberals are less motivated by disgust. This is a toolkit that you strategically use, just like you're strategic in the use of tools when you build a building, something that has people in it. If you don't use the right tools, it won't stand up. And you can think the same thing about a good claim. This is true for both grounds and warrants, as well as conclusions, where, remember, grounds are saying, yeah, the problem exists and it's big or it's common. Warrants, we got to do something. Conclusions, what we're going to do about it. And finally, for best, and this is really important to note, especially as we will continue to examine Best's argument, making a claim is just the start of it, because your claim is going to come up against other claims, and those other claims are going to be of two sorts. One sort is counterclaim, which is a claim that is directly competing with yours and saying, yeah, your claim, it's wrong. And there's going to be a different set of grounds and warrants and conclusions that are drawn to try to marshal the argument successfully or unsuccessfully that this claim over here is wrong. So grounds against grounds, warrants against warrants, conclusions against conclusions. So you can have social problems, conflicts. And in some ways they resemble culture wars. They can marshal different audiences because they're drawing on different cultural conceptions of what is right or moral or just or proper. So there can be those counterclaims, claims and counterclaims, and there's this struggle. Which one wins? It could have to do with how many people are convinced. It could have to do with how loudly one is voiced versus the other, how visible one claim is to how visible another claim is, and that's where resources come in. Because resources can get your message sent out far and wide. It can get it to the desks of the right people, the decision makers, and so there is a clash between possibly these two sides in this culture war, in this social problems war, for victory. Where victory in the short term has to do with awareness and voice, which claims get heard and paid attention to and agreed with, and in the long term, policies. What gets enacted as a set of rules, or the dismantling of rules about the way the world should be run. There's another set of claims out there that are perhaps not in argument with your own claim. Perhaps you are making an argument that there's a disease out there, like multiple sclerosis, that is really important and needs to be attended to, and we need to do something about it. Well, the reaction you might get might not be, you're wrong. It might not be multiple sclerosis is not a problem, but it might be, I can't pay attention to that right now. I've got all these other problems on my desk. Or, yeah, that seems like a problem, but I think these other problems are bigger problems. I just can't attend to it right now. In our societies, we have limited attention spans. We have limited brains with which to think. We have limited time with which to plan with other people and bring about solutions. We have limited economies in order to spend with in order to take care of these social problems. And so you could have a field, and if you look carefully in the case of diseases, you will notice that there are nonprofit organizations, each of which is trying to get a certain month made awareness month for this disease. Well, there are only 12 months in the year. How many diseases can you fit in? Maybe if you can't get a month, you can get a week. Maybe if you can't get a week, maybe you can get a day. Maybe you won't be able to get an awareness day for your disease that your nonprofit organization is advocating for at all. Perhaps no one's even heard of your disease and doesn't believe that that disease is salient, that it's not visible to them. They don't even know what it is. And that might be not because these other diseases really have something against your disease, not because they're arguing against you, but because these other disease social problem organizations have successfully grabbed our attention. And they're what we're looking at, they're what we're paying attention to, and they are what we are going to start to address first. So, as we move forward in considering social problems, think about claims not as this dry, simply made set of assertions backed up by logic and observable fact that once we see, we simply say, aha, that is a problem, let us finish it off by engaging in some kind of very clear action. That's the objectivist point of view. But if you're a subjectivist saying, no, this is something that we're going to have to fight for, and we're going to use the rhetorical tools of grounds, warrants, and conclusions, and we're going to marshal resources in order to bring our claim to people's attention as well. Resources and rhetoric to support a claim, with counterclaims coming down and trying to smash your claim, and other claims simply trying to crowd out the space and get themselves heard, which means that perhaps yours won't be. This has been James Cook with the Social Science Program of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I hope this has helped clarify the idea of claims in Joel Best's constructionist approach to social problems.